Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Before we begin today's session of comprehensive news analysis, an important announcement. There is an upcoming workshop on 30th of January 2022 at 11 a.m. which will be taken by Mukesh Jha sir, where he will be discussing the apt strategies, tips and all the guidance that you require if you are planning to attempt the 2023 examination. Do join in for that workshop. The link to register is given in the description of the video below. Now let's begin our analysis of today's Hindu newspaper with the first article that talks about the importance of merging India's informal sector with the formal sector. The authors here make a point that informal economy of India makes a bulk of India's economic sector, and there is an urgent need to merge it with the formal sector since the people working in the informal sector, number one, they don't really pay any taxes. So it is a big dent on the tax collection of the government. Secondly, the workers in the informal sector don't get any social or job benefits, and it is in their own best interest if they become a part of the formal Indian economy. The authors say that since 2016, the government has taken many efforts to formalize the economy, such as the move for demonetization, introduction of GST, digitization of financial transactions. All of these steps have been in the direction to ensure that people come in the circle of banking transactions, and when online transactions take place, they are much easier to track for the government and the agencies as compared to the cash transactions. All of this have resulted in a lot of informal sector workers registering themselves on the government portals and becoming a part of government's formal sector. There are a lot of benefits that you can get if you're a part of the formal sector. Number one, if you're a part of the formal sector, your productivity is much more as compared to earlier. The reason being, for example, if I own a company and I have 100 workers working for me, all of these are registered workers. I pay them money in their bank account, I cut TDS taxes on them, I deposit their PF, etc. Now, when I own this factory, I am assured that all of a sudden all these workers will not leave their jobs. Why? Because there are laws that if you want to leave your job, you have to give some notice period. So there is certainty in the working conditions from both the side of the owner also and the side of the workers also. There are fixed working conditions, meaning that the productivity is always more as compared to informal sector. Secondly, in formal sector, the people who are working, they have access to social security benefits. For example, again, as I said, your provident fund contributions are made through your company. You may also be a part of the national pension scheme. Not just this, as I said, you have certain notice period at your job. You can't be thrown out of your job all of a sudden. There are certain laws that prevent you. There are laws that decide the maximum number of working hours, etc. So all that give a lot of social security benefits to people working in the formal sector, which are not available otherwise. Now the question is, why is it that India has such a large informal sector? As per government's own report, more than 90% of workers in India actually work in informal sector. If you believe the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, they say that informal sector is a result of excessive state regulation on enterprises and labor. In other words, because it is so difficult to take permission from the government, because it is so difficult to take licenses from the government and the authorities, people prefer not to register anything and they run themselves as an informal organization without having to pay any taxes or without any compulsion to give a minimum amount of salary to their workers. IMF says that if the government simplifies the registration processes, eases the rules for business conduct, and lowers the standard of protection for formal sector, we will see more people coming in from informal sector towards the formal sector. This is what the IMF says on one hand. Authors, on the other hand, don't really agree to this. The authors say that we might argue that yes, this can be one of the reasons behind a large informal sector in India, but assuming that if the government tries to ease down its rules, everyone will come in the formal sector, that is not true. The authors say that in the mid 1980s, when India wanted to promote employment, that is when India thought that for small enterprises, we will not put a lot of rules and regulations, especially in labor intensive manufacturing industries. We will not put them under a lot of regulations. So the government thought we will give freedom to certain sectors, but On the other hand, when it comes to large scale industries, we will put them under regulation. We will ask them to take licenses, and only then they will be able to work. Now, the good part about this was that these industries, which were let free by the government in 1980s, they led to increase in employment. But the problem is, while the employment increased, the tax collection did not. Because this is the problem with informal economy. Let's assume there's a person who sells Maggie on the road, or a person who sells any snacks on the road. If they are earning 10,000 rupees, or maybe even more than that, because there are some famous street vendors who earn a lot of money. If they don't disclose how much money they are earning, because most of that would be in cash, they will not be liable to pay any taxes. So the amount of taxes that they pay would depend upon their income, and they themselves decide how much income would they want to disclose. So while the informal sector allowed a lot of people to get employed, on the other hand, it did not really benefit the government because it did not increase the tax collection on the government's end. And because the government has lower tax collection than what it requires, it ultimately decreases the economic growth in the country. Authors here say that if the government really wants to push informal workers into the formal sector, the solution is that government should focus on bringing economic growth. By taking examples from around the world, it has been seen that when an economy grows at a faster pace, automatically most of the informal sectors translate into formal sector. That has been seen in East Asian countries in the second half of 20th century, when most of them transitioned from agri-based economy to manufacturing economy. In that era, when they saw a high rate of growth, there was a large scale transition from informal sector to the formal sector. But in India, that has not been the case. Even though we have seen great economic growth in the past couple of decades, our transition from informal to formal sector has been less than satisfactory. Even today, 90% of India's workers remain in the informal sector and contribute to about half of India's GDP. About 75% of informal workers are actually self-employed, like the daily wage workers or the people who are street vendors, and their average earning is less than the regular salaried employees. Also, they don't even get any unemployment benefits. Now, let me give a very simple example. So, when the lockdown started, the government decided that we will transfer some money to the bank account of those people who have lost their job due to pandemic. Now, the question is, how will the government get to know who lost their job during the pandemic? The simplest way for the government to do this is the government will look at the EPFO contribution. So, when you're working in a formal organization, from your salary, there is a specific amount that is deducted and that is added to your EPFO account, that is Provident Fund. So the government will see in how many EPFO accounts now the people are not depositing their money. If there are 10 lakh people who have not deposited any money in their EPFO account since the lockdown, means these 10 lakh people have lost their jobs. So this is one of the ways in which the government can get to know who has lost their job and who are unemployed. But when you are working in the informal sector, when you are anyways not contributing to your PF, you are anyways not registered anywhere in the government record, how will the government get to know that you lost your job, and how will the government help you? So this is one of the problems that we have with the existence of the informal sector. That is, you are not recognized by the government, and even if the government wants to help you out, they would not be able to identify you. Government has tried to ask these workers to register on the government portals, but again, that is not a permanent solution. As per the article, the State Bank of India prepared a research report according to which since the pandemic has started, there has been a trend of informal sector transitioning to the formal sector. In fact, informal sector's GDP has shrunk considerably to less than 20% of India's total GDP from 50%, which it used to be just a few years back. But the authors say that this is not a permanent trend. As soon as we see the lockdowns getting shifted, as soon as we see the market opening up, the informal sector will flourish again. The long-term solution to this problem, if the government really wants to bring informal sector into the formal sector, is to focus on economic growth and make sure that this growth impacts even the bottommost person in the economic chain of the country. Just asking the laborers to register on official portals will not ensure that they will get social security, considering that we don't really have a great record at that. So the government's only solution has to be focused on economic development. Now, there are a few more facts about India's informal economy that you must understand. As per the International Labour Organization, informal economy is not just an issue in India, but it is an issue across the world. About 60% of the world's population actually participates in the informal sector. This is mostly prevalent in developing nations, but in developed nations also, we see a large section of people working in the informal sector. Informal economy basically are those organizations or workers who are not registered, where employers do not provide any social security to employees. As in, for example, if you are working in a proper registered company, let's say I'm working at BYJU'S, I get 2 days off in a week. So I have 5 days a week working and 2 days off. I get a salary paid for the entire month, but in that month I have certain holidays. However, if you're working in the informal sector, if you take a day off, most probably you will not get the salary for that day. If you fall ill, there is no compulsion on the employer to pay you for that particular day. So the informal sector does not ensure any social security to the people who are working. These include the farmers, agricultural laborers, owners of small enterprises, street vendors, etc. Our own government's periodic labor force survey says that over 90% of workers in India are actually informal workers. Now, the main difference between formal and informal economy, as I have been telling you in the past also, is in a formal economy, there is a formal contract between the employee and the employer. Predefined work conditions, so you are beforehand told what do you have to do and where do you have to perform your duty. There are job responsibilities given to you. There is a fixed salary with certain perks or incentives. There is a fixed time duration, etc. On the other hand, in an informal economy, there is no such contract. Your employer can ask you not to come from tomorrow. He is not obliged to pay you for any day that you taken off. He is not obliged to pay you if you fall ill. Your salary might not come on the fixed date. It might be paid to you in parts or unevenly, and there is no way that you can go ahead and file a complaint to anyone. There are no fixed working hours, etc. That is a major difference between formal and informal economy. From the government's point of view, they get taxes mainly from formal economy, while the informal economy is hard to track and hard to ask for taxes. So it is in the government's interest also that most of our economy becomes a formal economy. Now the question is, what has the government been doing to ensure that? The government of India has taken multiple initiatives to ensure that as many workers as possible register themselves on formal portals and find jobs in the formal economy. For example, the government has newly consolidated the labor codes, which includes some provisions for the informal economy also, including the gig economy and the workers who are impacted by pandemic-like situations. The government has also developed the e-Shram portal for creating a national database for unorganized workers for a realization of their employability and for the government to get to know whether they are employed or not. The government also has a Udyam portal for registration of the MSME, which gives steps for the MSMEs who want to register themselves. Because again, the companies say that we want to become formal, but it is so difficult to register themselves with the government portals. So it makes it easier for them. We also have the Pradhan Mantri Shram Yogi Man Dhan, which is a central sector scheme and is implemented through the LIC and community service centers. It seeks to benefit 42 crore workers from the unorganized sector of the country. So while the government has taken multiple steps, they have not resulted in a significant improvement so far. The next article that we have talks about the interesting political situation in Kerala. So what is actually happening in Kerala is that the Kerala government is trying to bring an ordinance to amend the Lokayukt Act of the state. In simple terms, the Kerala government wants to cut down the powers of the state Lokayukt. Why is that? Kerala has always been famous to have a very strong Lokayukt. Lokayukt in Kerala, in fact, has the power to ask a public servant to vacate his or her office if the allegations against that person are found to be true. In fact, in April 2021, the state Lokayukt had asked the Minister for Higher Education and Minority Welfare, K.T. Jalil, to resign after allegations of nepotism were found to be true. Now, the interesting part is that Lokayukt is right now hearing matters involving the Kerala Chief Minister and one of the other ministers in his cabinet. Now the government is worried that what if the Lokayukt asks the chief minister or the other ministers to be removed? They don't want to be removed through the Lokayukt, and that is why they are planning to cut down on the powers. Because right now, as per the current law, if the Lokayukt says that a minister has to be removed, there is no appeal against that decision, and they cannot disregard this order given by the Lokayukt. Thus, the Kerala government is now in a hurry to introduce an ordinance to remove that particular provision. The government says that it is unconstitutional since Article 163 and Article 164 say that the minister can be removed by the governor on the advice of the chief minister. So, how is it that the Lokayukt can have the power to remove the public servant? The Lokayukt may recommend, but his power should not be final, and there should be a provision given for at least making an appeal. Opposition parties obviously are not happy with this. The opposition parties are asking Kerala governor not to sign on this ordinance. The most interesting part is that it was the same party in power when the law actually came into being originally in 1999. Another interesting part is that the Kerala government, that is the LDF, which is an alliance of multiple parties, main party that is ruling over Kerala is the CPM. Interestingly, whenever we have had a discussion about having a Lokpal at the center, the CPM party always wants a very, very strong Lokpal at the center. But when it comes to their own state, now they want the power of the Lokayuk to be cut down because now it is concerning them and their ministers or chief ministers may be at danger. So that is what is happening in Kerala right now. The governor has not taken a decision on this ordinance so far. Now, the issue of Lokayukt is seen in many different states. There are issues about the power of the Lokayukt in Goa. There are issues about the power of the Lokayukt in Nagaland also. It was in the news that the Supreme Court had asked the Lokayukt of Nagaland to step down and transfer all his job and all his responsibilities to the Up Lokayukt. A few years back, there was a problem about Lokayukt in UP also, when the UP government was not changing the Lokayukt even after his tenure was over, and the Supreme Court had to step in and had to appoint a new Lokayukt just because the UP government was not doing it. So it is not the first state to have an issue with the Lokayukt, and it will certainly not be the last state in India. Lokayukt, as you know, is a counterpart of Lokpal at the center. It is an anti-corruption authority appointed by the state government in interest of the public. It mainly investigates allegations of corruption and maladministration against the public servants. Now, the entire story of Lokpal at the center and Lokayukt at the state started in 1966 when the first ARC, headed by Morarji Desai, recommended setting up of these institutions. Thus, in 2013, after the Anna Hazare agitation, the Lokpal Act was passed by the parliament. But interestingly, some states in India, including Kerala, had already appointed a Lokayukt before the 2013 Act was passed. Also a fact, Maharashtra was the first state in India to have a Lokayukt of its own. Lokayukt is usually a former High Court Chief Justice or a former Supreme Court Judge and has a fixed tenure. It is a Chief Minister who selects a person as a Lokpal after consultation with the High Court Chief Justice, Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, Chairman of the Legislative Council, Leader of Opposition in the Assembly and Leader of Opposition in the Council. The Lokayukt cannot be dismissed or transferred by the government and can be removed only by an impeachment motion passed by the State Assembly. The next article is actually a kind of an explainer explaining you key terms about the Union Budget, which will be presented on the 1st of February. Now, all of you would have read about the Union Budget in Indian polity also and in Indian economics also, and I'm sure most of you are aware of the terms that are used in the Indian budget. However, we'll still try and understand these important terms which are used in the Union Budget as they are explained in this article. The article says that the Union Budget has mainly three components. Expenditure, that is the money which is spent by the government. Receipts, that is the money that the government gets either by imposing taxes on you or through non-tax revenue, for example, from ONGC, from railways, from LIC, etc. And the budget also talks about deficit indicators. That is, how much deficit is the government facing right now in different fields. Let's look at these three components one by one. First, the expenditure. Now, we have discussed this multiple times. There are mainly two types of expenditures. First, capital expenditure. Capital expenditure is the one that mainly leads to building of any infrastructure, like if the government builds an airport, or if the government builds a highway, or if the government builds a bridge or a road, all that is called capital expenditure. In the long run, capital expenditure will be beneficial for the country because it will give jobs to the people. It will result in building of infrastructure. So it will be good for the economy in the long run. Capital expenditure mainly leads to solid infrastructure being created. Second type of expenditure is the revenue expenditure. Revenue expenditure is that expenditure against which nothing is made. For example, salary that the government has to pay, the pensions that the government has to pay. When the government pays this, the government does not get anything in return. So, the long term objective is to reduce revenue expenditure because the government is not getting anything in return. Expenditures are also of different types depending upon where they are spent. It can be on general services, on economic services, social services, and grants in aid by the government. When you add the economic and social services together, that is called government's expenditure on development sector. So development sector mainly is economic services like communication, development, agriculture, etc. and social sector, that is education and health combined. So this was the first component, that is expenditure. The second component of the budget mainly is a receipt, that is from where exactly is the government earning the money. So government can earn the money through number one, revenue receipt, number two, non-debt capital receipt, or number three, debt creating capital receipt. Revenue receipt means when the government earns from taxes and non-tax sources, like the income tax that we pay, the GST that we pay, that is a revenue from tax. Non-tax source, as I said, the government companies that are earning money for the government or the fines that you are paying to the government, those are all non-tax revenues. The second type of receipt is non-debt receipt, that is recovery of loans and proceeds from disinvestment. So the government of India may have given some loans to the state governments or maybe to some other countries. The money coming back from those loans is a part of non-debt receipt. Proceed from disinvestment means, for example, right now the government of India sold Air India to the Tata Group. So the 18,000 crore that came to government of India, that will also be a part of non-debt receipt. It is coming from disinvestment. The third type of receipt that the government has is debt creating capital receipt. In simple terms, the debt that the government takes. For example, the government takes debt from the market, from the World Bank, from the IMF. All those are money that the government is getting, but it is against a debt which the government has to pay back later. The third major component of the budget, as we discussed, was the deficit. Deficit simply means when you are spending more than what you are earning. Simple. So there are three main types of deficits that you must understand. First, fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit simply means when the government's total expenditure is more than the government's earning. So if the government is earning, let's say, 10 lakh crore rupees from revenue and from non-debt, the first two ones, and the government is spending 12 lakh crore rupees, then the government of India is in a fiscal deficit of 2 lakh crore rupees. In calculating the fiscal deficit, we don't add the debt that we are taking. Okay, fiscal deficit simply means our expenditure minus the earning that we are getting, our own money that we had, not the debt that we are taking from outside. Then we have primary deficit. Primary deficit simply means that the fiscal deficit that we had, 2 lakh crore rupees, let's assume in that 2 lakh crore rupees, the government is actually spending 50,000 crore rupees to pay back the interest of the loan that we had taken earlier. The government of India would have taken many loans earlier, let's say from other countries or from World Bank or from New Development Bank. Every year we have to pay back their interest also. Let's assume this year we paid back 50,000 crore rupees in interest. So primary deficit will be fiscal deficit means 2 lakh crore minus 50,000 crore. So 1.5 lakh crore will be the primary deficit for the government of India. And then we have the revenue deficit. Revenue deficit simply means fiscal deficit minus the capital expenditure that the government is making. So again, if the fiscal deficit is 2 lakh crore, you subtract whatever money that the government has spent in capital expenditure. So in building of roads, bridges, airports, etc. For example, if the government has spent 1 lakh crore rupees in that, the remaining 1 lakh crore remains the revenue expenditure. Again, all these are basic definitions which you have already read in economics, but it is just for your revision here. Now, the interesting point to understand here is whenever government makes any expenditure, so whenever the government spends any money, it is good for the country. Why? Because it leads to jobs, it leads to more money in the hands of the people. How will the government spend the money? For example, if the government is building a road or the government is building an airport, there will be thousands of people working there. They will be paid salary by the government. So government's expenditure means more money in the hands of the people. On the other hand, when the government cuts down on its expenditure, that means that there would be lesser money in the hands of the people. So that is how the budget decides how much money will the people get in their hands. The budget does not directly give money to the people, but the budget decides how much will the government spend so that the people can expect more money in their pocket or not. The other thing that the budget does is it decides on the taxes for the coming year. It decides on the corporate tax, it decides on the income tax, etc. Again, if the government in the budget reduces the tax, that means more money in the hands of the people because you won't have to pay so much taxes to the government. On the other hand, if the government increases the taxes, that means lesser money in the hands of the people. So, in simple terms, one single budget allows the government to control the economy immensely, deciding on how much money will be in the hands of the people or in the hands of the corporate. That will decide how will the next financial year look for the entire country. Now, it's not that the government can make any budget without the limit. When the government is making a budget, government obviously has to make sure that we don't spend too much money as compared to the money that we are earning. Means our fiscal deficit should be kept low. The government has made itself a target of these indicators what the government should control. These are based on the NK Singh committee report. The government has given a target to itself for debt to GDP ratio, means how much debt can the government of India take. Fiscal deficit to GDP ratio, how much fiscal deficit can we have, ideally 3%. And revenue deficit to GDP ratio, how much revenue deficit can we have at max. All these are self-imposed targets for the government. Remember, it's not that any international organization is giving us this target. It is our own target. But the good part is, if we reduce these numbers, if we bring it to this limit, that means India's economic outlook will improve. The credit rating agencies will give a much better ranking to India. Our own economic development will improve, and we will obviously see much more investment coming into India, resulting in much better jobs. Thus, in short, it is in the best interest of everyone for the government to bring these numbers as down as possible. Now, while this was the economic point of view of the budget, let me also tell you the polity point of view of the budget. It is Article 112 of the Constitution that talks about the budget. Interestingly, the word budget is never written in the Constitution. The Constitution of India says that it is the annual financial statement. It is a statement of estimated receipts, how much money will the government earn, and the expenditure, how much money will the government spend. In the parliament, budget mainly goes through 6 stages. First is a presentation, when the finance minister will come and present the budget and the copies will be distributed to all the members. Then there will be a general discussion without going into detail, when the opposition members will say, not a great budget, against the farmers, against the middle class, and the government will say, oh, the best budget ever. Then the parliament takes a break. In that break time, different departmental committees will scrutinize the budget. So, for example, committee related to the railways will look into the demands made related to the railways ministry. The committee related to education will look into demands made by the education ministry, etc. Then after that, the parliament comes back. They will start voting on the demand for grants. This is where cut motions, etc. can be passed, which are just a formality. After this, we have the passing of appropriation bill, allowing the government to withdraw money. And then in the end, passing of the finance bill. Within the finance ministry also, it is the Department of Economic Affairs which is actually responsible for preparing the budget. There are many other departments within the finance ministry as well, do remember. In 2017, there were some changes made to the union budget. For example, the date of the union budget presentation was advanced. Earlier, it used to be the last working day of Feb, and now it is on 1st of February. Second, the merger of railway budget happened with the general budget. Earlier, we used to have separate railway budget, and earlier we used to have a separate account of plan and non-plan expenditure. That has also been removed because now we don't really have 5-year plans. The next article is on a topic that we have discussed multiple times in the past couple of weeks. That is the argument that the schools must open now. There are not many new arguments that are written in this article. The article says that Omicron, fortunately, has not really resulted in any significant upsurge of hospitalization or deaths. In fact, more than 95% of available beds are unoccupied right now. However, despite all these encouraging signs, schools continue to be shut down in most parts of the country, and the state governments are just not willing to take a chance because they think that the children are still unvaccinated. However, all of that is without any scientific proof. Serological survey by the ICMR to test how many people have already developed antibodies against COVID found out that more than 70% of children in India already have COVID 19 antibodies without even having any vaccine. Thus, we must understand that with every passing day, we are learning out on precious time of learning because it has been such a long time since the proper working of schools has been seen in the country. And as we discussed earlier, online education cannot be seen as a substitute for various reasons. Number one, there is not a universal availability of such devices, especially in rural areas in India. You can't really expect these devices to be present in every household. Even in urban and semi-urban cities, where one family might have one laptop or one smartphone, it is not easy if a family has more than one child. How will more than one children sustain with that one smartphone or one laptop, and who will attend those classes, especially when the parents are also working from home and they might also need their laptop. All these are issues that we are overlooking right now. Not just this, with the closure of schools, we don't have midday meals, and the nutritional supplement that we used to give to the students has also been taken out. COVID-19 pandemic has not ended, but we must understand that with 2 shots of vaccination and with a lot more learning, we are much better prepared to now handle the situation, and it is time to open up the schools now. Most countries across the world have already opened up their schools, and India is one of the few that is still waiting for all the students to get vaccinated before we open them up. The impact of such long school closures will only be seen a few years down the line when we would have a generation without any basic financial literacy or numeracy. Thus, the article says that the states must prioritize expanding their vaccine coverage, insist on masks on the children as well, but in any condition open up the schools, because this decision of school closures for such a long time is not based on any scientific evidence whatsoever. Experience from nations such as the US and UK suggests that reopening of schools has not led to any surge in infection whatsoever, and we must incorporate these lessons as soon as possible. Now, to show you the impact of school closure for such a long time, I have taken this data from a UN report which talks about a similar education crisis that was seen in Africa when the schools were closed for a long time due to the Ebola crisis. Experts believe that the longer that you close down the schools, the lesser is the chance of students returning back to the schools. And that was seen during the Ebola crisis of Africa. For example, the UN report said that in Guinea, when the schools were closed for 5 months, 486 hours of learning was lost, and there were 7% children who never came back to school after that. Similarly, in Liberia, when schools were closed for 7 months, 25% children never came back to school. And similar was the case with Sierra Leone. In India, schools now have been closed for almost 2 years now. In between, the schools were opened for a few days for higher classes, but nothing has been done, especially for primary and pre-primary stages, which are the most formative years of one's life. In fact, it is those children for whom it is extremely difficult to keep on sitting in front of a laptop or a smartphone day in and day out and ensure online learning. The same report also tried to compare children who are right now in school and children who are not in school and the learning gap that we have. Although the report does not take India into consideration, but it has given a sample of 5 nations. Let's see Pakistan. In the Punjab province of Pakistan, if you look at children between 12 to 14 years of age, they are right now 50% behind in their learning level as compared to those students who actually are going to school from this age group. Similar is the case in nations such as Bangladesh, where more than 25% learning gap can be seen between children who are going to school and who are not going to school. Now, just compare 2 individuals, one in a village who might not have a smartphone, or even if they do have a smartphone, they might not have a great internet connection. as compared to those students who are sitting in Delhi, Bangalore, Mumbai, Hyderabad, etc., where they have access to all the technology. You might not see a learning gap of students who are in the metros right now, but what about the students who have lived the last 2 years of their life in a village who have not been able to get access to that education? How will we fill that gap? That is what the government must think about, and we should open the schools as soon as possible because we have to believe that the worst is over and we are much better prepared to fight with that problem now. Next, again, is an ongoing story between China and Lithuania, which we have discussed multiple times. In short, as you know, Lithuania a few weeks back allowed Taiwan to open up their representative office in Lithuania by using the name Taiwan itself rather than Chinese Taipei, which angered the Chinese government, and since then there has been a lot of issue between these two nations. Since Lithuania is also a part of the European Union, now the European Union has come into the picture and given their support to Lithuania. China had downgraded the diplomatic relations and had even called back their ambassador from Lithuania. And now it is EU's turn to take the next step. EU has now launched a case against China in the WTO for targeting Lithuania specifically over its stand on Taiwan. EU says that we have been forced to do this because ever since this issue has started, China has stopped importing anything that is made in Lithuania. In fact, any European product that has a component that is made in Lithuania, even those products now are being rejected in China, which is against the policy of WTO. The member nations of WTO have agreed to provide national treatment to all the goods irrespective of their place of origin, and China is going against that. EU is saying that we have made several attempts to discuss this issue with China, but China is not agreeing to it and is sticking to its stand, and thus we have no other option but to approach the WTO. The structure of European Union works in such a way that it is a European Commission that handles the trade policy of all the EU members, and they are the ones who will take this matter to the WTO on behalf of Lithuania. Lithuania alone will not have to fight this case for itself. The other part of EU's policy is that when EU files a case against any country in WTO, they give a 60-day window to the other country to respond. So China right now has a 60-day period in which the two countries can discuss and come down to a solution. If nothing happens for 60 days, then EU will have to ask the WTO to form a panel so that this matter can be resolved at the international stage. China, obviously, on the other hand, is extremely angry about this. They are saying that this issue between China and Lithuania is a political one and not an economic one, and it should not have gone to the WTO. But again, if China is calling it a political issue and not an economic issue, they were the ones who actually stopped trade with Lithuania and stopped import of any product that has any component made in Lithuania. So China is right now changing its stance depending upon whatever suits them right now. Now, if you look closely into the issue, you will realize that what EU has done is just symbolic. Because when you go to WTO, it takes several years for the case to resolve. And EU also knows that very well. In fact, there are hundreds of cases that are right now backlogged in the dispute settlement system of WTO. Thus, you will not see this issue also being resolved in the coming months or even in coming years. This is just a symbolic or a diplomatic move made by EU to show China that we are backing Lithuania right now. As I said, once EU launches a case, China has a 60-day time period to enter consultation with the bloc, and after that EU will request establishment of a panel at the WTO. If you look at the numbers, there is a solid case against China. Lithuanian Federation industrialists have said that over 1/13 are unable to send their products to China or clear their shipments through custom. The economic value of those goods is about 29.9 million euros. The most affected sectors have been pharma, lasers, electronics, food and beverages. In fact, the official record of China's customs says that the trade of goods from Lithuania to China has dropped by 91% in December as compared to same period of last year. So China right now cannot take the stand that this is not an economic issue because they are making an economic issue out of it. Now, as I said, this move is symbolic because it is very hard right now in the WTO to resolve any dispute. That is mainly because the appellate tribunal of the WTO's dispute resolution body is not working for many years. So the process is if one country has to file a case against the other country, you go to the dispute settlement body. The General Council of the WTO itself meets in the form of dispute settlement body, and then on the request of the country, they will form a dispute panel to look into this issue. The report of the dispute panel can be challenged in the appellate body of the WTO. So obviously, whenever one country loses this case in the panel, they will go to the appellate body. This is where the problem starts. The appellate body of the WTO has not been working for many years. It only has one member out of the three. US, China, both of them are not allowing appointment of new members. US was doing it first because it was unhappy with WTO. China now also has started this. So there are many cases pending involving India as well in the WTO which have not been resolved because the appellate body of WTO has not worked for many years now, and there is nothing that anyone can do about it until USA says that we are fine with it. That is why we are saying that this step by EU will just make the headlines in the newspaper but will not really result in anything on the ground. This fulfills two purposes. Number one, it allows the EU to show that we are standing up for Lithuania. On the other hand, it also allows the EU to continue its trade with China because they know at the end of the day, they cannot hamper their trade with China because it is extremely vital for them as well. These were the articles we wanted to discuss on the Hindu newspaper today. Now a couple of practice questions. Number one, what initiatives have been taken by the government to bring informal sector into the realm of its formal counterpart? List out the benefits of such initiatives. Second, describe the major components of the union budget as presented in the Parliament of India. Both these questions have to be answered within 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.